When God moves, we need to get on board. It doesn't make sense in that moment for us to pause, to hesitate, and to say, hang on a second, God, let me see if I can do this. Let me see if I can work this out. And that's the thing about seasons of change. It's hard because when a new chapter starts, we're often still stuck in the old one. Old wineskins, trying to do things the way we used to do them. Change happens every day. Now, when we talked about new chapters 2 weeks ago, I mentioned the Greek philosopher Heraclitus and his famous quote, "You can never step in the same stream twice. The water will have passed, stones will have moved around, little bits of sand will have shifted. When you step into that stream again, it is a new stream. Life is full of changes." And all around us, God is moving and involved in a number of changes. That's not to say God is manipulating the world. God is moving and we have a choice. We can join with God in whatever is next, or we can cling to those old ways. It really doesn't make sense to cling to the old because things are changing either way. Bob Dylan had it right when he sang, "Come gather round people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept that it's soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, and you'd better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. For these times they are a-changin'." That's not how Bob sang it. These times they are a-changin'. But nobody would have gotten all the words unless you knew the song. And I don't know if this was prescient or just timely, but I had no idea we would all be drenched to the bone when I thought about using "these times are a-changing." But there are lots of examples of people leaning into changes throughout Scripture. If we go back to the beginning in Genesis and look at when God first called Abram in Genesis 12, we see that in verse 4, 12:4, Abram immediately set off. God said, "Go," and Abram went. When God called Moses in Exodus 3, it wasn't quite so immediate. Of course, Moses had to list all those reasons why. I'm not good enough, Exodus 3:11. I don't know what I'm doing, Exodus 3:13 and 4:13. He mentions that one twice. No one's going to believe that I was here with you. That was at the beginning of Exodus 4. And my very favorite, Moses' excuse, is from Exodus 4:10, "I don't talk so good." Even with these excuses, though, even arguing with God at the burning bush, Moses still went. When God called Samuel in 1 Samuel 3, first he thought it was Eli in the other room. But once Eli said, no, kid, I wasn't speaking. And he heard the voice again, Samuel said, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." The list goes on. But what about us? When God is doing something, when God is speaking, when God is leading us into a season of change, do we accept it? Do we go with God? Or do we embrace these changes? Or do we go back to what we knew, the comfort zone, leaning back? Changes, new seasons, these things can all be disorienting. I mean, even little things, new traffic patterns. You come up to a crossroads that you're familiar with, you know exactly how it goes, and you get there, and all of a sudden, the signs are different, the lanes are painted differently. They did that just over here in that north intersection to get to 250. And at first, it was a little confusing. There used to be a turn lane there. Why not now? Friends who move away, or friends who just drift apart. That can leave us lonely. New trends can make us feel left out. I'm not going to open my robe to ask if my tie is too wide or too narrow or if it's just right, but these fashion trends are hard to keep up with. Changes can be big in our lives, or they can be the little things that are all around us. And the other question with fashion sometimes is, does it matter? And the answer is, to some people, sadly, yes. So what did Isaiah do with change? The book of Isaiah is the start of the latter prophets. So it falls in a different place in the Hebrew ordering of books than we find in our Old Testaments. In the Hebrew, Isaiah comes right after Kings. It's the final book of the former prophets. And 2 Kings in our Bibles ends with the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem and deporting and exiling all of the Israelites. Talk about changes. And that's where Isaiah begins. There probably was an actual Isaiah, and he probably connected with the first part of the book. It prophesies death and destruction, and that would have been the deporting and exiling bit of the Babylonians showing up. And the first part has this sort of hopeful look ahead to the future, but the second part, chapters 40 to 55, which is where our reading is, that part is much more anxious for a change, much more ready for God to do the restoring. The final part leans more heavily on the future. But the other day I asked on Twitter if anyone could summarize the entire book, all 66 chapters of Isaiah, in a single tweet. Yeah, I thought that was a good question too, but someone responded, "Keep your eyes open, someone's coming." That's not a bad summary. Keep your eyes open, someone's coming. I might say it a little different. Keep your eyes open, something's happening. Our reading opens with a pronouncement of God's solemn verdict on behalf of Israel. I'll break down all the bars. God's voice didn't come from that pain, right in the middle of the change they were going through. God's voice didn't come from the tough spot where they stood. God's voice in the prophecy comes from the other side. God's speaking from the good news portion. In our case, God's voice doesn't come in the midst of our turmoil, our storms, our difficulties, our questions or struggles. God is already on the other side and can see where everything is going. That's what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 13, where it says, while we're here, we only see through a glass dimly, but then when we get to that other side, we shall see clearly. Then we shall see face to face. God's already there and sees what is ahead. The message of this passage is of keeping faith, even as we go through all the changes that life brings. We may not understand them. We may not like them. We may not know whether these changes are good or bad. We can only live our lives in real time. What seems like the worst day today may not actually be so bad in a few years when we gain that wisdom of Ecclesiastes, of some time where we can look back and see where we've been and how we've traveled. As we get into this reading in Isaiah 43, we can't mistake the allusion to Exodus. It says, the Lord makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters. I know it's a reference to the Hebrew people walking across the Red Sea on dry land with Pharaoh's army in pursuit. I get that that's what Isaiah is referring to. But for me, it brings to mind all of the safe passages I've enjoyed at sea. I was thinking about this idea of a way in the sea, a path on the mighty waters. And I thought back to the 2002 Chicago to Mackinac race. And the wind hit the entire fleet with a storm, so it wasn't just our boat. And it was actually pretty bad. The Weather Channel did a special about it at the time. But I remember that we made it through. A humanist might argue that we were safe because of good seamanship and a sound craft. As a Christ follower, I give thanks that in that moment, when the wind laid our boat over on its side, a wave could have knocked it the rest of the way over, and we could have turtled right there. I could have slipped off the deck when I was going forward to release some of the rigging that was caught. That was my job. The Lord makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters. In each change, we get to choose how we respond, how we react. We get to pick how we view the changes in our lives. Big changes come in all shapes and sizes. Graduation, marriage, children, changing jobs, changing careers. Some are good, some are bad, some are stressful, some are exciting, some are frightening, some are joy-filled. Isaiah prophesied that God said, don't remember the former things. Don't consider those things of old. I'm about to do something new. Sometimes God is doing something and we don't see it. In 1929, there was an Oxford professor who had been struggling with faith, this idea of God. He resisted and resisted. He didn't like the idea of a God that you pray to, a God that you believe in, a God that you worship. And he describes it this way. You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach, the one whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had come at last upon me. In Trinity term of 1929, I gave in. And I admitted God was God. I knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. This, of course, these were the words of C.S. Lewis, writing in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Lewis went on to pen some of the greatest works of Christian literature in the 20th century, and he was a reluctant convert. He resisted that new thing God was doing all around. In Isaiah, God's new thing was restoration after the former thing of destruction and deportation. Walter Brueggemann writes that this theme of the whole section of Isaiah 40 to 55 comes back to inescapable judgment, reliably followed by generous restoration. These constitute both Israel's lived memory and their defining theological conviction. So what's God doing right now? What's God doing in your life? And how can we climb aboard? How can we listen and open ourselves up and say, I want to do what you're doing? It starts by recognizing changes are happening. And then we get to make our choice. We can accept it. We can take new wineskins to hold that new wine. We can adapt and listen to hear what God is saying, to try to be open to where God is leading, and try to follow where God already is present and working. And join in what God has been doing probably for a while by the time we get there. We can't avoid changes, but we can move forward in faith. We can trust God is, in fact, God, and God is ahead of us. Lord says, I'm going to make a new thing. How we respond is up to us. Amen.